이 환자들에 대한 정보가 상당히 중요한데 매뉴얼이 될 수 있기 때문에 그래서 기회가 될 때마다 그런 여기서 다큐멘터리를 하듯이 나도 다큐멘터리를 만든다고 생각을 했습니다. 이런 비슷한 코로나 바이러스 감염, 신종 코로나 바이러스 감염에 대해서 사실 그렇게 많이 무섭진 않았고요. 메르스의 경험, 2015년의 경험.
MERS was a coronavirus that terrified South Korea, killing 38 people and sickening hundreds more. The government was vilified for its response. Soon after, legislators pursued a series of critical reforms.
2015년도에는 그 진단법을 질병관리본부에서만 가지고 있었고 민간 의료기관, 대학병원, 종합병원에서는 검사 키트를 주질 않았습니다. 그게 큰 페인이었다고, 실패의 원인이었다고 생각을 해서
As a result of that, they passed a law in order to speed up the approval process of these kits in a time of emergency.
On January 27th, South Korean health officials summoned representatives from more than 20 medical companies to put in place a national testing program.
It was such an urgent request that they just met in a conference room at one of the train stations in Seoul. The head of the equivalent of the CDC, he basically said, manufacture me these tests now and forget about the approval process. You start using them, start testing. We will come back to make sure it's accurate, but we'll do that while you're already in the field.
Within a matter of days after that, the first diagnostic test kit was approved, and it's a process that typically can take upwards of a year. There were 4 cases at the time, and it would be another few weeks before there was a death. But they really felt the need for diagnostic testing to be able to see where the problem was and to deal with the threat.
By January 27th, South Korea was on its way to containing the virus and preventing an economic shutdown.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today at HHS.
In the United States, Azar continued to emphasize the response that had so pleased President Trump. We've got this.
The playbook for responding to an infectious disease outbreak is relatively simple and multi-tiered. You identify cases, isolate people, diagnose them, and treat them. Then you track down all of the contacts of the infected person, and you do the same with those people and the same with contacts of contacts, if necessary.
It sounded like a perfect plan, but it was missing a key detail. There was no comprehensive national testing and tracing program. Even so, the CDC stuck to a version of the script drafted by Azar.
The CDC will continue its aggressive public health response strategy, working to protect the health and safety of the American public.
Right now, there is no spread of this virus in our communities here at home.
Appointed by Trump after his predecessor left in disgrace, Redfield was a controversial virologist who had no experience leading a public health agency. During the AIDS crisis, he preached a religious approach, calling for abstinence as a solution. With his former assistant, Deborah Birx, Redfield's attempts to push an unproven HIV vaccine were twice investigated for scientific misconduct.
Redfield is a little bit of an oddity for the CDC. The CDC is an institution filled with scientists and researchers who don't like to be told that science has to compromise for economics or for politics. They want to be purist. Donald Trump is a president who has expressed an incredible disdain for science since before he took office. Inside the West Wing, they refer to the CDC as the deep state. Certainly, many of the people at the CDC saw Redfield as not having the kind of backbone that they would like to have seen in a CDC director to stand up to the president, both privately but also publicly.
Some scientists were willing to push back. Public health officials from around the country shared doubts that the CDC was responding to the virus with enough speed and concern. They circulated an email chain which included Trump officials called Red Dawn.
What's going on here, my friend?
It was a tongue-in-cheek nod to a 1984 movie about a small band of American citizens who fight back against a Russian invasion.
This is the emergency broadcast system. We are under attack by...
We were a little bit like the Wolverines from that movie.
They know who all of you are. They're looking for you.
A group of teenagers that are fighting back. And one of us thought it would be funny to use Red Dawn as the subject title. That email chain, it's a group of former and current state and local officials within the federal government.
These are all very dear colleagues that have been in public health and emergency response for a long time. In late January, we were cautiously monitoring, trying to assess when it hit us, how big the scope of the calamity that we are looking into and how to mitigate it.
I think in January, the cat was already out of the bag in terms of we had cases in the US, we had human-to-human transmission going on in the US, and we were going to be dealing with COVID-19.
I mean, I wasn't able to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what could go wrong for us.
The Red Dawn emails would be full of warnings and recommendations from experts in pandemic response. But politicians failed to recognize that there were lessons to be learned.
There's never been anything like this in history. There's never been. Nobody's ever seen anything like this.
Nothing could be further from the truth. To be ready for the perils of the future, all one had to do was look clearly at the past.
In 1918, in the midst of war, influenza marched across the earth from country to country. Epidemic lurked everywhere. To ward off contagion, special precautions were taken.
With no vaccine and few treatment options, simple but effective precautionary measures, like masks, were all people had. The H1N1 flu infected 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population at the time. The death toll can only be estimated, somewhere between 20 and 50 million people. Since 1918, scientific advancements like the invention of the electron microscope have allowed us to see the invisible enemy. But even with vaccines and advances in pathology, the growth of global transportation made other pandemics ever more likely. In 2003, the deadly SARS coronavirus, spread from bats to humans, was quickly contained. In 2009, the Obama administration faced a challenge when a new strain of H1N1 emerged.
Good afternoon, everybody.
There's no doubt that every president should learn from what has happened before. President Obama felt it very important from the beginning and all the way through our dealing with H1N1 that the scientists make the calls.
H1N1 influenza is here. I'm Dr. Tom Frieden. I directed the CDC from 2009 to 2017.
I just sprayed down the chair with Lysol.
All right. We dealt with epidemics of Zika, Ebola, MERS, and H1N1 influenza. Our emergency operations center was activated more than 90% of the time that I was there. That's a way of reducing exposures if there is a lot of H1N1.
We do think there may be some challenges, though, practical challenges. President Obama made it very clear that HHS was in the lead and that I would be the spokesperson for the flu, as he would call me the face of the flu. H1N1 was very scary because children were particularly vulnerable.
Hi, it's Elmo.
And I'm Secretary Kathleen Sebelius.
Elmo and Secretary Sebelius.
Teaching kids to sneeze into their elbows was a big thing. First, you learn to sneeze into the bend of your arm like this.
Oh, very good.
13,000 Americans died from H1N1, and the Obama administration mishandled vaccine distribution. But scientists gave the administration high marks for moving quickly and being open with the press and the public. Just 4 years later, the Obama administration's response to the Ebola crisis would be criticized for being too slow.
In the case of Ebola, I remember being in the room in the White House briefing room.
You guys are up here talking about we have this great and perfect system that's going to be able to, contain this virus because we've done all this preparation, and yet it doesn't look like it's working. And so
Hindsight is always 20/20. I can look back at any outbreak I worked on and say, I made a series of mistakes there. We all do. But the key is, are they unforced errors?
I think it is important to reflect on whatever lessons we learn, we build and incorporate.
After the Ebola crisis passed, the Obama National Security Council had essentially created a unit within the National Security Council dedicated to sort of pandemic response.
You can't see our clip, can you?
No, I cannot see Ben. I can see his hand when he moves it out here, but he's got a face shield on. It's pretty good, hardcore.
Beth Cameron was in charge of countering biological threats for the Obama administration.
We set up a new directorate on global health security and biodefense, and I was honored to be able to lead that directorate, and also to be able to take on a lot of the lessons that we really had learned after the Ebola epidemic.
In 2016, Beth Cameron and her team at the NSC drafted a 69-page playbook on how to deal with a pandemic.
The playbook was intended to allow people in the White House to ask questions. What should we do? And also, what do we need to do to get ahead so that we're not constantly reacting?
So what happened to this playbook?
So the playbook is reported to not have been used.
The Obama administration did not leave to this administration any kind of game plan for something like this.
I have no idea why Mitch McConnell said that he didn't know about the playbook. There were a large number of copies that were spiral bound of this playbook. It was briefed to the incoming administration. It did become politicized.
Some have erroneously suggested that the Trump administration threw out the pandemic response playbook left by the Obama-Biden administration. What the critics failed to note, however, is that this thin packet of paper was replaced by 2 detailed, robust pandemic response reports commissioned by the Trump administration.
The last thing that they wanted was to pay attention to what the Obama people wanted them to pay attention to. They were trying to make a clean break from what they saw as a disastrous presidency, and this was the Trump presidency.
I think it's important to understand that biological threats are not the thing that is always top of mind for a senior leader. But there really was a lot of pressure on all of the civil servants in between Barack Obama and Donald Trump to explain why we need high-level officials who are looking at that issue all the time. After I left, I continued to work with the Trump team in my new position outside of government until the directorate was dissolved in May of 2018.
The Global Health Security Team was disbanded under a reorganization by Trump's National Security Advisor, John Bolton.
It was really shocking that any administration would get rid of so much experience and expertise and the collaboration and coordination that comes with those years.
From the moment of Trump's inauguration, the guiding slogan of staffing was not "you're hired," but "you're fired." Key positions went unfilled. Many more were eliminated. And when people were hired, experience was not nearly as important as loyalty. On January 29th, the White House announced the formation of an official task force to confront the threat of the coronavirus.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Azar.
Led by Azar, the task force had little scientific expertise. Most were businessmen and lawyers, seemingly chosen for their political or religious beliefs. One had been Sarah Palin's foreign policy advisor. Another was a climate change denier who opposed homosexuality as an act against nature. The only 2 public health officials were Redfield and Dr. Anthony Fauci. At the National Institute of Health, Fauci had advised 6 presidents and had been at the forefront of every epidemic response for the last 40 years.
The issue now with this is that there's a lot of unknowns. As you can see just from the media, the number of cases have steeply inclined each and every day.
At the first briefing, they announced no concrete programs to contain the virus inside the borders of the United States. Instead, they offered a variation on a familiar Trump refrain: build a wall.
Foreign nationals, other than immediate family of U.S. citizens and permanent residents who have traveled in China within the last 14 days, will be denied entry into the United States for this time.
In the months after that, tens of thousands of people from China still make their way into the United States, mostly Americans who are returning home and are not blocked by that ruling.
Diamond Princess, this is your captain speaking from the bridge. We have been notified that 10 additional people have tested positive for coronavirus.
The captain of the Diamond Princess had docked his vessel in Yokohama after learning a passenger had tested positive for COVID-19. The Japanese government ordered a 14-day quarantine. Eventually, over 700 passengers would test positive. That made the Diamond Princess the largest known outbreak of the virus outside of China.
Donald Trump, save us. Get us a government-based airplane.
Not even that, just like...
Get us off the ship.
I received a phone call that a disaster medical assistance team was being assembled to do a rescue operation to go pull American citizens off of the Diamond Princess and bring them back to the US. And I was asked if I would be willing to go as an expert to help the team.
Okay, they've got a bunch of people in white coats.
They were marching.
Lined
They're not
up
white
there.
coats, they're white hazmat.
They're white hazmat suits. They've got these little tunnels down here, the ET tunnels, I call them.
At the time, we still didn't know a lot about the transmission dynamics or even the severity and lethality of the disease.
The Diamond Princess confirmed many of what I was nervous about. First of all, it shows how it spread in a confined environment with lots of people, right? Even though all of them has their own cubicle, but that's exactly like apartment complexes in New York City. And you go out, right? Go to places confined in a mall and in classrooms, in dormitories, in many settings. It basically gives us a very parallel world of what could be happening to us.
Even after the ship went into quarantine and passengers were really restricted to their rooms, the fact that the outbreak continued to grow demonstrated that there may be more to transmission phenomenon than we initially thought. So when we saw that, that really hit home to us that this is a pretty explosive situation.
Okay, they quarantine, but yet the spread is like fire. It shows, it really highlights strategic test is a must.
Eva Lee began to sound the alarm in the Red Dawn emails about asymptomatic spread and the need to test widely. She knew in early February what federal officials refused to recognize. Only a vast infrastructure for mass testing could spot and contain a virus that was already moving invisibly across the country.
Then I thought to myself, that is it, that we will have no chance to contain. If we are not going to take actions now, we would regret and we would be late.
The trifecta is test, trace, and isolate. You need to have all three of those working in tandem to be able to take down any infectious disease. I'm from Hong Kong and I grew up during SARS. So I guess that was my first experience with an outbreak, which has turned out to be an interesting reference point during this outbreak. My boss was like, you should cover the coronavirus. So my question's gonna be, where are we deviating from the playbook? That's where I hold the government accountable. So the CDC made a test that worked in their lab before the first case of COVID landed in the state of Washington on January 20. What they saw as their next step was sending test kits based on their design to public labs around the country.
So CDC can't just make a test and send it out. They have to apply for emergency use authorization.
This week, the FDA issued an emergency use authorization for the CDC's diagnostic test.
Having a declaration of an emergency allows you to cut it through a lot of red tape where you don't have to approve things the traditional pathway, which takes many years. So it's like going through the pre-check line at the airport.
FDA issued the EUA to CDC really on February 4th, and test kits were available on the 5th.
The test kits will start shipping to over 100 U.S. public health labs.
Each test kit can perform up to 800 patient samples.
It works in about 4 to 5 hours time.
And that's pretty heroic in 2 weeks to develop test kits for the country.
So far, speaking of the playbook, everything was going right.
The first thing public health labs have to do after they get the test is they have to verify that the test works in their hands, in their laboratory, with their scientists. So on Saturday, February 8th, labs opened up their boxes and they started to get the test up and running. And then the next morning, I see a number of emails from public health laboratory directors saying, we're seeing this problem with one of the components of the test, the N3, and is anyone else seeing that? Then my phone started to blow up. It became apparent that we actually had a real problem. And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is a nightmare.
There were many labs that were having the same problem. So that was an indication that this was coming from the CDC labs. There are 3 components to the CDC design test. They're called the N1, N2, and N3 assay. And the N1 and N2 assay together look specifically for the COVID-19 coronavirus. And then they had a 3rd component, the N3 assay, which was designed to look for any coronavirus. And I don't know why they decided to throw that 3rd part in. They didn't need it, but that 3rd part is the part that caused all the problems. It was a contamination problem.
This was just a huge light bulb moment where, wow, we could really be on pause.
The CDC says they're working with states now to fix the tests. They did not say how many of the kits have flaws.
Now, this was really frustrating to a lot of lab directors because they were like, look, the N1 and N2 part of this test are working totally fine, so why don't we just ignore the part that isn't working?
Under an emergency use authorization, you're not supposed to do that. You have to run that test exactly as it's assigned.
As it turned out, over 90% of public health labs had tests that were not working.
So it was really as if we were flying blind, and we knew it. And frankly, there was nothing we could do except wait.
There was a working, effective test that was created in a German laboratory that was being distributed by the World Health Organization to countries all around the world.
It is available now, and we are shipping an essential component to labs to really start working immediately.
The WHO test, quite frankly, is used for low and moderately income countries. I think it would have been very unusual to use another country's test, and not for political reasons, just, I guess, because of maybe scientific hubris. We've never had a failure like this.
Despite the technical problems at the CDC, the Trump administration could have insisted on an alternate plan. Public labs could have pivoted to the WHO test or removed the N3 element. Test manufacturers and clinical labs were eager to start making their own tests, but for reasons that remain unexplained, the FDA put the brakes on the approval process.
Yeah. Looks like the setup is pretty good.
Oh, good. Doctor approved.
Yep, exactly. My name is Tyson Bell. I'm an infectious disease and critical care physician at the University of Virginia. I'm the director of the COVID ICU. It's really important to know who's positive in the community and to be able to test in a widespread, aggressive fashion so that we can really stop the chain of transmission of the virus. Traditionally, there's a lot of leeway when it comes to federal regulations and hospital laboratories' ability to set up their in-house testing. But the thing about the emergency declaration was that it made the diagnostic innovation more difficult because now it had to go through the FDA. So now all of a sudden, any university laboratory that has the experience and the know-how to set up their own in-house testing now has to clear it in order to make this work.
We're not a public health lab. As a clinical lab, we're not part of this system. You know, the CDC and the state public health labs are fantastic, but clinical labs, like hospital clinical labs, commercial labs, perform 90 to 95% of testing. We really are the front lines of the public health system. And so it's really important that we're part of that conversation as well.
So we're trying to figure out, is it better to just deal with the FDA and the backlog there and set up our own in-house testing, or do we just wait for the CDC to fix the issues with the test? We decided initially to wait, and that was the wrong decision.
Many labs gave up rather than face the thicket of bureaucratic rules. But Alex Greninger did not give up and instead began to slog through the FDA regulatory process.
And so at that point, you had to really go fully in. You got to make your own test. So we got the template and the paperwork, couldn't get the comments back until you mail in the document. Even though you'd email a document, you had to burn it to a CD or a USB and physically send the document as well. The original process suggested testing 50 positive samples, but in that case in the US, there were 14 known cases. But even getting that one sample, that one positive sample, was the hardest part. And obtaining clinical material from the CDC is very difficult. And I think that was when you realized that the FDA and the CDC maybe hadn't talked a ton.
While federal agencies failed to talk to each other, the virus swirled in mid-February through a series of square dances in suburban Seattle. With every do-si-do, the virus changed partners. But without testing, scientists couldn't follow the spread. The emergency steps meant for speed and innovation slowed the process down to a crawl. The White House could have cut through the red tape. The mystery is why those in power didn't force the bureaucracy to find a quick solution.
While we were on pause, the anxiety level of our members just increased exponentially day after day. There was just more frustration, concern, frankly, sadness, because we weren't able to do our job. That was really tough.
While testing in the US was stalled, in South Korea, the government was already moving to contain the virus by utilizing a comprehensive national testing and tracing program.
I think they did a much better job. I think starting from the testing rollout, a lot of our jealousy early on was just how rapidly they were able to test a large proportion of their population. And they were testing relatively younger asymptomatic people as well as older people who had more severe diseases, and they were able to do contact tracing.
Because of the laws that were passed in 2016, enabling contact tracers to obtain vast amounts of information in the name of disease control, there is a large amount of data that authorities here can access. Cell tower information, CCTV footage, credit card data, and this information was pushed out to the general public using cell phone alerts.
그리고 2월 중순 동안은 거의 환자가 없어서 외국에서 들어오는 환자 말고는 없어서 우리가 잘 대응했구나라고 방심을 하고 있었을 때 지금 알게 된 거지만 에어로졸이 생기는 그런 조건 중에 가장 큰 게 소리치고 노래하는 것들이라는 거를 이제 알게 됐고 코인 노래방이라는 게 있습니다. 조그마한 방 안에 들어가서 노래 부르는 그거는 에어로솔 전파를 너무나 잘 보여주는.
If two people singing could spread the disease, imagine thousands singing in one room. A major outbreak was traced to the Shincheonji Church, a doomsday Christian cult led by a self-proclaimed messiah, Chairman Lee.
Hallelujah.
The Korean government descended on the city of Daegu, where the church had its primary place of worship. By testing, tracing, and isolating the followers of Chairman Lee, officials tried to prevent the virus from spreading to the rest of the city.
Thousands of additional people had been exposed.